I think it's probably okay to start reading. He'll probably wander over here when he's ready.
Okay. Well, we are in the last session of 9. The book that we have been studying is Seeds from a Birch Tree, Writing Haiku and the Spiritual Journey by Clark Strand, who was both a Zen Buddhist monk as well as an English teacher at different points in time. Which actually is rather ironic to be studying considering the noise level around the apartment complex. We start off with reading from the book and then we go into discussions. Today's first segment is De Chum. I never had the privilege of studying with Takahama Kiyoshi, who died when I was only 2 years old. However, I had a teacher who in one crucial respect was just the same. My first Zen teacher was an elderly Chan Buddhist monk living out his retirement a few miles from the town where I attended college. It seems improbable to me now that a Chan monk would have been living in Mont Eagle, Tennessee, but with the innocence of youth, I simply accepted the fact that when I heard it and went to see him. I was 19. Dechun's small house was chock full of odds and ends, and everything in it was made from the cheapest possible materials: plywood, 2x4s, the piece of foam on which he slept. One room was heated by a small 2-burner wood stove about ankle high, upon which he also cooked all of his food. Everything he owned looked as though it might have been pulled directly out of other people's garbage. He was very small and frail looking. What I remember most about his appearance was how, even with his few remaining teeth, he just smiled anyway. His clothes were all purchased at the local Goodwill store without any regard to style or era, though I seem to recall he preferred earth-tone colors. As I write these words, it occurs to me for the first time that they were the clothes of old men who had lived out their lives and died in Mont Eagle, Tennessee. He must have shaved his head with some regularity, for his hair was always very short gray stubble, and I cannot now recall ever having seen his head completely bald. Several years ago I lost my only photograph of him, a badly executed instamatic shot, too dark to see much of anything but his face and diminutive body dwarfed by a door frame. I am now certain I would never have given him a second look had I not been told by my art history professor that he was a Chan Buddhist monk and probably the very last of a line of Zen recluses still painting in the old Chinese style. I once asked him how he made such beautiful paintings, and he replied by asking me how I drove a car. We had just returned from a drive around the mountains, so I thought he might just be putting me off. But he insisted that I show him. So finally I mimicked the movements of driving, turning this way and that, now and then reaching down with one hand to shift the gears. When I had finished, he mimed the movements of painting something like a tree limb, following a line this way and that, every few moments returning to an imaginary inkwell to dip his imaginary brush. This was the way he always taught. He never spoke of Buddhism or Zen. He lived on $50 a month, didn't have a phone, and never used more than the minimum charge for electricity. He gardened all year around, somehow managing to extract vegetables from the ground underneath a thick, clear plastic sheet even in the dead of winter. Though he was a strict vegetarian and would not even use honey to sweeten his food, preferring molasses instead, I noticed that whenever I took him out for a meal at one of the local greasy spoons, he would happily accept anything I offered, short of meat. He seemed concerned that I did not eat properly, and insisted that I ought to think about that before I started getting any big ideas about Buddhism. I had no idea what he meant. I just thought of him as some kind of fanatical vegetarian and avoided discussions of food whenever I possibly could. My friend Michael and I had a hard time with him at the university. He seemed to lose his manners and become completely uncouth the moment we brought him into contact with other people. He would purchase a huge bag of potato chips, empty them over the surface of a table, and invite anyone who passed, including our professors, to share them with us. Whenever we passed a beautiful girl on the sidewalk, He would cover one nostril and blow snot out of the other at her feet. We once had him over for dinner because a certain religion professor, a specialist in hermeneutics, had wanted to meet him. He arrived somewhat better dressed than usual, wearing a second-hand wool sports coat, became drunk on a thimbleful of wine, and chattered all night long about the communists in China, seeming not to understand any of the questions he was asked. When my first wife and I were married, however, we received a beautiful card copied out in copperplate script, regretfully declining the kind invitation to your wedding celebration of May the 26th, and wishing us a long and happy life together. Once, when we visited him after that, my wife was so overcome with affection that she leaned over suddenly and kissed him on the face. I remember that he blushed but did not pull away. After that she received a number of plain white U.S. postal cards partially covered over with Chinese mountain landscapes drawn in blue ballpoint pen. When I left the monkhood in 1990, my Japanese Zen teacher told me that a student never fully appreciates his teacher until they have been separated for at least 10 years. This lesson was brought home to me in a powerful way last year by circumstances which were, however, altogether ordinary. I returned to Sewanee, Tennessee, for my youngest sister's graduation. Had I not been back in many years, with me I brought my second wife, Perdita, at that time 4 months pregnant with our daughter. There were many places I wanted to show her, but Dechun's house was the most important of all. It seemed that everything had taken place within its walls. But after searching every street in Monteagle, the house was nowhere to be found. Later, prompted by my declaration that the house was no longer there, Michael flew from Berkeley to see for himself, and, of course, found it just where it had always been, looking slightly better kept, as a home for a woman and her son. Perdita said she thought I didn't want to see the house again, and perhaps she was right. In any event, at the time I felt dejected. In a kind of daze, I allowed myself to be led into the local grocery store, where I stood around feeling lost, while Perdita looked for vegetables to make a salad. Soon, a very large man approached me and began to talk about my sandals, their make and design, a similar pair he had owned just last year, and the pair his brother had bought last spring. He frightened me a little. He wore a crew cut, army fatigues and a t-shirt, and he seemed a little unhinged. But after a moment I realized he was friendly after all, only he was mildly retarded. So I relaxed, and we spoke about sandals and footwear in general, and I noticed that his hair looked unusually soft, like Dechun's had looked. One never knows why certain events seem so much more powerful than others. Why, for instance, a funeral affects one less than a watch taken from a drawer after many years. But as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I had to stop the car. After a moment, I started up once more, but had to stop again. Finally, I just wept, and the thought that kept going over and over in my mind was that Dechun's teachings had left nothing out. They had been so unremarkable and plain, I hadn't noticed them at all. I'll give that a moment to sink in before I go on to the next, because I need a drink. Sorry about that. And yes, it is. And hello to everybody that made it in. Thank you, Jaeger. Okay, so now that my throat no longer itches quite as much, the next segment is failure and disappointment. Think of it this way. In the beginning, we understand a haiku to be only a 17-syllable poem. Later, we find out more. There are certain principles that need to be mastered before we are proficient at the art. There is a discipline to take up and perfect. But the perfection of that discipline turns out to be a bust, and the principles we worked so hard to perfect are just the same, which is a great letdown, because we have become very invested in what we could do. This very disappointment is the beginning of true mastery. Ultimately, the ego cannot reach beyond itself with all of its perfected technique. However, the way of haiku will not emerge until it has been offered up. I once heard haiku described as a perfectly transparent window on the world. A few years later, I came across a poet who suggested that the window was open so that it was possible to look at things directly, rather than through glass. Nowadays, I would say that the perfection of haiku comes only when the house has been abandoned for the out of doors. He concludes that particular segment with a haiku. The white butterfly disappears in a sun shaft on the rocky trail. And that one just kind of totally took my mind elsewhere for a moment. I'm sorry. Yes, very vivid. Very simple, very vivid. Okay, the next segment. Yes. The next segment is called the superficial art. Some of the stuff in this section you may or may not agree with. If you have something that you differ with, definitely make note of it and feel free to share it, because we can discuss that after all the reading is done. Haiku is a shallow art. I sometimes begin a workshop with those words. I find they somehow set people at ease. Almost always, some people have come fully expecting to write a Zen poem, while others fear that even their best effort will be rejected. So the overturning of expectations all around has the effect of bringing people back to where they are, which is a good place to begin writing haiku. I ought to explain, however, that the word shallow, at least when applied to haiku, does not mean lacking depth. Rather, it means that in haiku, we find meaning in what lies right before the eye. We don't look past the thing itself for something else. This is really just another way of saying that haiku leaves the mind and the objects of nature in their natural state. It does not make them into ideas, nor does it make them subject to attachment or aversion. It also means that the haiku mind is like a mirror. And that is something that gets brought up in Zen Buddhism a lot, actually, as well as Pure Land Buddhism. We sometimes notice when we read classical Japanese haiku, and especially those of Basho and Issa, that they often choose as their subjects things which are more ordinary than beautiful, and at times even slightly distasteful or repugnant to our ordinary way of thinking. On his celebrated journey to the far north, Basho writes about being bitten by lice and fleas, and the sound of a horse pissing next to his pillow. At another time, he writes of sea slugs all frozen together in one lump. And At still another, of a warbler's droppings fallen on a rice cake at the end of a veranda. Isa writes about shitting and about pissing in the snow. And yet in all of these haiku the principal point, in which each poet takes a kind of secret joy, lies in the fact that each of these things arises directly from the haiku mind. They are not separate from it. They are in its natural expression, even as they may bring a grimace or a smile to the poet's face and the reader's in turn. And, of course, haiku such as these point to a profound spiritual truth where beauty is concerned, namely, that it is more useful and more spiritually nourishing to find beauty in what is ordinary and close at hand than to invent it solely from the mind in accordance with some predetermined code of values, and especially a code that sets one thing against another as being lovely on the one hand or detestable on the other. Sorry. And yes, I can see both sides of your discussion there. I can. My stress level lately has been messing with my lungs. That's okay. That's all Aussie. And it kind of makes my throat go weird too. Continuing on, the wisdom of haiku, then, comes not so much from keeping to the surface of the moment, since that is impossible by ordinary reckoning, for thoughts and feelings naturally arise, but from recognizing whatever rises is the activity of, and not contrary to or separate from, the ground of being. So, when I speak of haiku as a superficial art, the surface I speak of is really just the ground of being. It is the haiku mind. And then there is a selection of haiku. These are written by different people. A fingernail moon, all that is left in the sky after the blizzard, by Perdita Finn. The weather vane points at the buds of cherry trees, pink and opening, also by Perdita Finn. An April shower turning the meadow greener than it was before, by Dennis Davidson. Repainting the house, yellow covering yellow in September light, by Susan Rudnick. When I walk away, the wet logs finally burn in the cabin stove, also by Susan Rudnick. I identify with that last one quite a lot. And it's okay to see things differently. For one person to see the beauty and another to get overwhelmed by trying to look at all the individual parts and then trying to look at the whole. Everybody perceives things differently. Okay, there's a few more sections. We're almost done. The Rose in the Vase. The following poem was written by a high school student in New Jersey last year after a brief introduction to haiku. The rose in the vase. It still blooms even though it's broken from the rest, by Jane Song. And that haiku there applies rather perfectly to this discussion here, I think. And And then the section continues on. The season is summer. A single rose has been broken from the bush outside and placed in a vase of water on the table where it blooms. It would be nearly impossible for someone who had studied haiku for a few years to compose a poem of this quality. Such haiku come only at the beginning or after many years. This is why it is sometimes said that haiku is a form best suited to children and to accomplished masters of the art. This is also the reason that established poets often have so much trouble with haiku, the reason why, far more often than not, they write bad haiku. They cannot understand that the greatest haiku are artless and uncontrived. In the beginning we see things clearly. On the one hand, we know very little and may find it difficult to tell good haiku from bad. On the other, we have fewer ideas to come between us and the poem. As time goes on, however, and we learn more about haiku, we tend to lose this fresh beginner's mind. We become too interested in being clever or profound. Unfortunately, as a result of this attitude, our haiku only become predictable and stale. They begin to have a tainted look, as though they had been handled too much in the making. Hello, Morgan! The way of haiku begins to emerge when, having mastered the subtleties of the art, one forgets them, becoming like a beginner again. To be sure, there is a difference. Having cultivated a deep understanding of haiku over many years of practice in contemplating nature, the master can afford to forget it all and just work naturally from the heart. This is because his understanding has become his heart. When he composes a haiku, there is no separation at all. Basho's last words. It is one thing to say that the proper concern of haiku is the things of nature, and quite another to really practice that. Even among those who practice it, it is quite another thing to follow it to the end. A story told of Basho says that on the last day of his life he mostly slept, but awoke around noon to notice that many flies had gathered on the sliding screen. His students were taking turns trying to catch them with a line stick. When Basho saw this, he only laughed and said, "Those flies seem delighted to have a sick man around unexpectedly." That is an interesting thing because that is also a haiku. The very last segment of the book is titled A Violet. When the master considers a violet, he forgets himself before a violet, and a violet marks the way. When a violet marks the way, it bears the master's mark. The mark is no other than a violet. A violet is the master's mark. And that is the end of what Mr. Strand has to say about haiku and the spiritual journey. Yeah. So are there any questions, comments, discussions, statements, haiku to lob? Yes, it was quite a lot this time. Welcome back, Seti.
The order. We're about to try and chain a haiku, so that's gonna be a thing. And Flex too, if Flex wants to participate. I know Flex has been kind of quiet.
Give me a second to come up with one.
No rush.
Hey everyone.
You're like second to last. I'm last, so don't worry about it. Okay, the order starts. It's Ame, Phoenix, Aussie, Seti, Morgan, Jaeger, myself.
Yeah, go up.
Yeah, and I'm the last one. Yeah.
Got more time to think.
Hey Mom,
What, buddy?
how many orange juice have?
If there's any orange juice left, it will be in the fridge. If not, then we'll have to mix some up.
Where is orange? Let's show me Mom.
If you look in the fridge and you see a bottle of orange juice, then we have orange
Bottle?
juice.
You
Yep.
bottle one? The first one?
It would be in either the door or in front of the shelves.
It's on the shelf. Oh wait, it's on the door.
Okay.
Let's choose. Oh, stepping up. Mom, does any orange juice? Yep. Should I put it back?
Okay, guys, try this one.